Welcome to Voices from the Village. I'm Chris Moore. Is there a positive outlook for the future of America? A country made up of individuals, families, and communities. A nation of divergent races, religions, and cultures. Some argue that we are allowing that diversity to destroy America rather than using the strengths of our differences to fix those elements within society that need mending. Assuming that argument is true, how can we begin to work together to ensure a positive future for all Americans? Over the course of our series, Voices from the Village, some of the best minds in the African American community will offer their thoughts, their perspectives on the societal components that work for and prey upon all people in America, but particularly people of color. We center discussion on building healthier individuals, families, communities, and supportive institutions. We begin this process with a discussion on Afrocentric critique and analysis, the need for African Americans to define their own strengths and weaknesses as they explore their history and try to reconnect with their cultural heritage. Our guests are two preeminent scholars, Dr. Naeem Akbar, a clinical psychologist at Florida State University and a pioneer in the development of an African-centered approach to modern psychology, and Dr. Asa Hilliard, an educational psychologist at Georgia State University and a scholar of ancient African civilizations. Dr. Hilliard, I've seen many white anthropologists try to define African Americans by our pathology. That's my own observation, and it seems strange when there's so much more to draw upon. Am I incorrect?
Most people that I'm familiar with who describe us in pathological terms are unfamiliar with African people. They approach the study of us a la Moynihan, for example, and not as an anthropologist but as a sociologist, and ask the question, what is it that Africans do not have that Europeans have? And that's, of course, the wrong question, because all human beings on the planet should be understood by their cultural identity. That's who they are. That means that the norm for behavior, what is normal, is a function of who you are, how you were socialized. And abnormal, then, would be a departure from the way that you were socialized, not a departure from the way European people are socialized.
Dr. Akbar, you seem to be nodding in agreement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think that it's an intentional selection. Mm-hmm. In other words, they intentionally select ways to reflect us in the most negative light in order to perpetuate a negative degeneration.
And there are times when we really believe it.
Most times, unfortunately, we believe it. But one of the problems, one of the important things are the kind of work that black scholars are trying to do around the world now is to regain the power to divide. And for us then to begin to identify the source of our strength and not this preoccupation with our pathology, which of course perpetuates the pathology.
I hear you saying that scholarship is very important to this effort.
Absolutely.
To anything. Mm-hmm. Scholarship, study, systematic study is absolutely essential.
And it sounds to me also like we need a new perspective on this. Maybe not a new perspective, but in fact an ancient one.
Exactly. It is really ultimately the perspective that all human beings use when they engage in their own self-definition, and that is that they then try to identify those things which accentuate their capacities for survival. That's what people do. It's not a black thing, it's not a white thing, it's not a European, it's not an African. It's what people do. People try to perpetuate their ability to survive most effectively. That's the perspective that we must adopt.
So have white folk around the world been very good at that perpetuation to the detriment of people of color?
In the study of African people?
Yes.
It's been devastating. White people around the world generally speak, as I said earlier, with little information, valid information about African people by looking from their own perspective, and sometimes in the service of political systems. For example, the psychologists, and I'm a psychologist, the psychologists at the beginning of this century were main contributors to white supremacy through their misuse of things like IQ tests, and they specifically stated that blacks were genetically inferior to whites, and they still say that. You know.
It persists today, the bell curve.
Over 50, well, see, the bell curve is important, but what's more important is that before the bell curve came out, a survey was done of 1,000 white psychologists who were fellows, either senior superior level psychologists, reported in the book by Snyderman and Rothman, and over 50% of them believed that white people were genetically superior to blacks. That's before the bell curve came out.
Well, how do we turn this around? Does your scholarship go for naught? I hear people who criticize it as saying it's new wave and not based in fact.
Our scholarship, by characterizing it, is not scholarly. You have to challenge the documentation, the data, but name calling hardly qualifies as scholarship. So I think that whoever said that is describing themselves.
It is predictable. In fact, for me, one of the things that validates the legitimacy of the scholarship is that it is challenged. And we would expect it to be challenged. And we presume that the challenge is going to be persistent. And we're hoping, however, that we will get the same kind of legitimate challenge, though, that other people get. That is, challenge me with facts. Don't call me names. Don't compare me with someone else's criteria. Let's look at the merits of what we are representing and the data that I bring to affirm what I'm trying to say. And I think that this is a part of the whole scientific enterprise. It's always a dialogue.
We collect all of this data. How does it enable us as African people to better our condition, especially here in America?
Well, I don't know how you would function without information. You know, I think that one thing we have to remember is that not only are all groups to be identified by their culture and ethnicity and so forth, but all groups, every group, and particularly every successful group, has a systematic strategy to socialize its children. In other words, that's not an accident. You don't leave that to chance. You put your children through a process to create the person that you want them to become.
Haven't we had that before, and did we lose it somewhere?
I think that if you observe what happens to many young people in the African community right now, is that many of them are literally raising themselves.